Lishas hamincha. Now, the question of lisha or afia, for that matter, there are many stages in the process of preparing a baked good, a baked, let's say, lechem aponim or shtel lechem and so forth. And the question is, as we began to discuss yesterday, what stages require a kli sharetz to be makadish it with kedushas haguf? And we'll begin our discussion here with a Rambam who says that kol hamenochos, this is the Rambam in Maisa Karbonos, Perkid Gimel, kol hamenochos hafuyos, those menachos that require afiyah, lishasam varichasam afiyosam bifnim ha'azara. Now, when you start the process with kernels, that are in their natural state, you need to be moded, right? We spoke about medida, about weighing them. You want to get an asiris ha'efa. And we spoke about the fact that if, let's say, you need more than an asiris ha'efa, and the kli could only hold an asiris ha'efa, so you do, stages, piecemeal medida. But if you assume that medida is done by a kli charetz, then that itself engenders kiddush saguf way before we get to the stage of afiyah. And therefore, if it has kedusha saguf, then anything that you do with that which is sanctified with kedusha saguf has to be done inside the azara. So the Rambam is basically saying A plus B equals C. If I assume that the medida is done with the klisharis, and hence once you do the medida, the soles is already sanctified with kedusha saguf, and I add B to the equation, that anything that has kedusha saguf has to remain within the azara. You're not allowed to take it out of the azara. Hence, all the processes of lisha, aricha, and afiyah with regard to those minchas afuyos have to take place in the azara. The Mishnah, on the other hand, seems to give us a slightly different approach. And this is a Mishnah Menachos on Daf Tzadi Heyom Beis regarding the lechem aponim l'shtei lechem, which are both obviously minchos afuyos, and it quotes a machlokas between the Tanakama and Rabbi Yehuda. The Tanakama is of the opinion that 2 out of the 3 of the processes take place outside the azara, and only the last process, so the lisha and the aricha, right, after you do the kneading of the dough, then you have to set up the dough in a certain shape, that's called aricha. All this is done b'chut, meaning outside the azara. The afiyah itself takes place inside the azara. Now that would mean, by definition, that according to Tanakama, we have not yet sanctified the soles as kiddush saguf. If we assume that once we put it in the lisharis, that was makadosh kiddush saguf, then there would be no way possible that we could take it out of the azara in order to do the lisha and the aricha. And Rabbi Yehuda disagrees with Tanakama. He says the lisha and the aricha is bifnim, and how much more so the afiyah. According to Rabbi Yehuda, every single stage, starting with lisha, going on to aricha, culminating in afiyah, must take place in the azara, because Rabbi Yehuda understood that since the solus itself, way before we get to the lisha stage, has been placed and measured in a kli shares, the kli shares has endowed the solus with kedusha saguf. We can't take it out of the mikdash. And Rabbi Shimon says that everything is done outside the azar. The lisha, the aricha, even the afiyah is done outside the azar. In other words, it's not done in the ovens that are in the mikdash compound, in the azar compound, but rather it's done outside. Now the Gemara explains over there in Masechta Menachos that the real source of the machlokas here, the bone of contention here between Tanakh and Rabbi Yehuda, is with regard to the midas yavesh, right? So let's say you have solas, which is yavesh. Where and when was it sanctified in the klisharis? And Rabbi Yehuda is going to insist that it was already sanctified in a kedushas with kedushas haguf in a klisharis way before we get to the stage of lisha. So therefore, there's no possibility of taking the dough, or for that matter, even the solus itself, the refined flour, outside of the azara, because we don't take something that has kedusha guf outside the azara, and it's already been sanctified in a kli sharetz. And he expounds on it. He says, she'im is kachu, right? If you're going to assume that there already was a kiddush, is nimsash is kachas soles, the refined flour was already sanctified with kedusha guf, al yidei mida, mida meaning when we measured it in a klishares, and then when we get to add the water, for example, into this flour, and we're ready for kneading, then yesh lelusha bifnim, we have to do the lisha inside the azara. Oh, so the Gemara says, but avol im lo hiskadju, if we're going to assume that when they put the solus into a kli in order to measure the volume of the solus, right? If it has a serious ephah, and that kli is not a kli shares, or alternatively, even if I grant you that that kli is a kli shares, but it's too early in the process to consider the soles as royal mizbeach because you haven't added the water, you didn't do the licha. There's a whole, future down the line, step-by-step process until it's royal mizbeach, and therefore the kli is not makadish. If eina soles kedosha is mana licha, then efshal alusha b'chutz, there's no problem of yotze. So that would give us an explanation for the Tanakama of Rabbi Yehuda. The Tanakama of Rabbi Yehuda says, Lishas and Varichas b'chutz, he's of the opinion that lo is kadosh. Again, for one of two reasons, either because they weren't measured in a klisharis, or the klisharis is not makadish until it's royal mizbeach, and it's too early. Hence, the lisha and the aricha will take place outside of the azara. But apparently, the Chacham assuming that the oven in which we bake the shtei lechem and the lechem aponim is located in the azara. So the afiyah, by definition, is going to take place inside the azara. Aval imlo hiskadju adayin ein asos kedoshim b'zman alicha aval kein efshal alusha b'chutz aval afiyasa b'fnim mishum shatanu klisharis hamakadsh. Now he has a footnote here. We've been discussing, and we'll get back to Reb Shimon in just a minute, the so-called minchos ha'afuyos. What about minchos that are not afuyos? Where do they fit into this whole process? So he has a discussion in the Rishonim in Menachos that he quotes here, and he kind of summarizes them in footnote number Kuf Mem Gimel. He says, "Aval shar menachos lishasan varichasan bifnim." Even though we've pointed out that according to the Tanakama of Yehuda, with regard to lechem aponim and shtei lechem, the aricha and the lisha was bachutz. Now we're saying the aricha and the lisha are bifnim. And why is that? Bishum hashemen shabahem. In other words, one thing is crystal clear, less man the poli, that the shemen itself is measured in a klisharis, and therefore the shemen itself was sanctified with kedusha guf. And with the exception of shtei alechem and lechem aponim, all other menachas have an admixture of shemen, and the shemen already has the status of kedusha guf. Therefore, the lisha and the aricha must, by definition, take place bifnim. What about minchas mafer? Yesh. Even in the case of mafetanu, there is shemen mixed in before the licha. And here he quotes Rashi and Tosfos that yesh behem matana rishona shel shemen shehi kodem nesinas hasoles v'lishasa. So we have to know more about the nesina of shemen, but he's assuming now that even in the case of minchas mafetanur, the shemen is added to the mixture before the lisha. And with that, given that the shemen is sanctified with kedusha guf, now the entire mixture is sanctified with kedusha guf, and there's no room for taking it outside of the azara in order to do the aricha and the lisha. Okay, now let's go back to the mission that we began with today, and we want to study Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon has lisha, aricha, afia, everything is bachutz. And why is that so? First of all, you have to assume ein tanur mekadesh, which probably means that they had another oven outside the Migdash, and that oven did not have the status of a kli sharetz. However, we have a machlokes between Rashi and Tosfos. According to the Shita of Rashi, the achashen is kadsha b'kli sharetz im yotzi uha meha azarti pasel b'yotze. Now, he doesn't clarify exactly at what point he puts it into a kli sharetz and he's mekadesh. All he says is that from that point and on, that it was sanctified in a kli sharetz. If you take it out of the azara, it's possible. But at what point exactly do you put it into a kli sharetz? And the impression I get is, and I could be dead wrong about this, is that according to Rav Shimon Shita, since the tanur is not in the azara and it's not makadesh, then we're going to have to take it after it's already completed and place it into a kli sharetz in order to be makadesh. Once it's got the kedusha, then it cannot go bachutz. If you take it out of the azara, it's possible. And now he quotes Tosfos. Tosfos says, "Shali achar shes kadsha b'kli sharetz, g'nayu lo lotzeis mifutz la'azara, aval eino nifselos b'yotze." So I can't explain to you this shita satosis. It's antithetical to everything that we know. We've always been assuming that after kiddush b'kli sharetz, it's got kedusha guf. It absolutely cannot, and this is critical, leave the azara. Tosfos is saying no. L'chatchila, for sure, it's a gnai to take it out of the azara. But that's only l'chatchila. And as far as b'di'evet is concerned, it's not possible. This is a pella to me. Again, you already sanctified it b'kli sharetz, and now you took it out of the Azor, there's no psul b'di'eved of Yotze. That's not working for me, but okay. Now, at this point in the discussion, he introduces the Rambam. And the Rambam in Perek Tes Milchus Maisa Karbonos says that Midas Yavesh is Kadsha. He says that as far as anything that's dry and is placed into a klisharis in order to measure it, it already assumed and received the Kedush Saguf. And yet the Rambam says that you can do the licha and the aricha of the lechem aponim, the shtei lechem bachutz. So again, we have the same problem that we had before. We're missing a piece of the puzzle. V'rak shar benachos niloshos bifnim. So now we're going to take a look at some of the achronim. Till now we've been doing Rishonim, Rashi, Tosfos, and the Rambam. Yesha pirshu b'shitaso she'im soles lechem aponim shtei lechem hayu modedim b'mida shel chol, that they had a minhag of measuring the soles for both lechem aponim and shtei lechem in a midah shel chol, which means a non-sacred utensil. And the reason they did this is because they didn't want to bake it on Shabbos. If they'll do the medida in a klishares and therefore be miskadshu, they'll have to bake it on Shabbos. And lo nitna Shabbos lidochas etzlan. Me'achar she'ena modim b'klishares shuv enam nifsalim b'lina. They want to avoid a situation where you'll have to do the shchita. I shouldn't say shchita, but the avoda. And therefore, they did it b'chutz. Yesha pirshu b'shitas lechem upon shtei lechem miskadshim b'klisharis rak le'inyan she'eno yotze lechulin al yedei pidyon, aval eno miskadshim liposel b'psulei kodshim. He says that the lechem aponim does not become possible with lina until they place it first on the shulchan, and the lechem of shvuas of shtei halechem is not going to become possible bil lina until after shchita. And which shchita? We're talking about shochat aleim es hakvos. You remember that the shtei halechem is accompanied by kivtzei atzeres. When we achar shenikar adom shlos kadshu adayin legamri, ein ze knai lo tzia michutz la'azor. And now he quotes another Tosfos. Sheladas HaMishnah, Shafias lechem aponim, eina docha Shabbos, is behechrei chois afiyosem b'chutz shekein nefu b'fnim his kadju b'kedush saguf hareim nifsolim b'lina. We can't wait till after Shabbos. It'll become possible mitzad lina. So we must assume that the afiyah of the lechem aponim, since it's not dochas Shabbos, must have taken place outside the Azor, because if it's inside the Azor, it has kedush saguf, and then there'd be a psul of lina. So that is the shita of Tosfos, and the Rama paskins that afiyosam b'fnim. Now we'll talk a little bit about licha. Kol hamenachos hayu niloshim b'mayim potrim. In other words, the water is a little bit warm. And the question is, isn't that going to bring chimutz? But in any event, the Mishnah allows you to do the lisha by adding mayim pochim, lukewarm water, we'll call it. The afshe bepesach also lolush es hamatzis bepochim mishum shalulim lovely de chimutz is belishas menochas lo chashul lekach mishum sheinases beazara v'akonim hamitzuyim sham zrizim v'yagshi yashgichu, shalo yachmitzu. So that which takes place inside the mikdash, we can rely on the kohanim that they'll guarantee that there's no chimutz. But as far as, let's say, for example, the question of chametz and matzah, that's an individual question in every household. We're going to try as we can to avoid any contact with water. And Drizim b'mikdash usually gives us the principle of ein shvus b'mikdash. Every shvus is to keep us away from being a little bit laid back and not careful. But if we're all zrizim in the mikdash, then we don't have to worry about a shvus. And now he quotes Tosfos. Is nevertheless Loshem also Poshrim. Now the Tanakama sheet is that Lechem Aponim requires a Lisha Bachutz. But nevertheless, this requirement of Lisha B'Poshrim applies even Bachutz. Shekemeach Shenase B'Tzibur Ein Loshu Shema Yovel Yidei Chimutz. But what I'm trying to figure out here is, in the case of the Lisha Bachutz, so the Poshrim problem doesn't bother me so much because Zrizim. But why is the Lechem Aponim Lichasa Bachutz? Is it because we want to avoid a psul of Yotze if we do the Levisha and Lisha inside? It seems that there's no, unless we know otherwise, there's no compelling reason to the Lisha to take place bifnim. And the only possible reason for that would be because he's going to be using Mayim Poshim. And we have to make sure that it doesn't come lidei chip. So for that, we need the Kohen Mitzuyim in the Mikdash, in the Azar. But if not for that reason, then we could use potion. Why? Because we're doing it bachutz. Wait a second, that doesn't make any sense. Lechem Aponim Lishos bachutz is loshen osamer potion. So again, I understand that if all things are equal, we're going to do the Lisha Bachutz. There's no compelling reason to do it. But what about Poshrim? I mean, if it's done Bachutz, there's no Mitzkohen and Mitzuyim Shem. Those reason. Again, I think that even though the leech is bachutz, it's nevertheless part of the avodah of the lechem aponim. And the lechem aponim, insofar as it is a carbon tzibur, requires that the tzibur get involved in the lisha. They don't have to be physically involved in the lisha. But we see that the lisha itself, even if it's done outside the mikdash, is still something that has the status of nasa b'tzibur, and therefore we can allow for licha b'mayim pochim. And finally, just before we end, Nechleku Rishonim Bisman Lishas HaMenachos Yeshe Kosru Shekodem Loshus HaMincha B'Mayim V'rak Li'achar Mikan Nosnu Oleh Es Matnas HaShemen Hashniya U'Balu Osa Ima. So we should do the Lisha of the Mincha B'Mayim, and only then should we add the Shemen. Yeshe Kosov Shekodem Belula Bashemen V'rak Acher Kach Loshu Osan B'Mayim. So they added the Shemen, and only afterwards they added the Mayim. Whereas the first opinion has that they put the Shemen and then they did the Belila. All right, let's just make a note of where we got up to.